Hello and welcome. If you're watching this, you're probably interested in calculation of ABV specifically for mead, but this could also be applied to beer and wine as well. We're going to be taking a look at our tools of the trade, what they do and why we're using them, our data collecting, why we're collecting it, and what data we are collecting, and of course a new calculation for ABV, which I'm sure is what you're primarily here for, but without all that other information, it's somewhat useless. So whether you're new to the process or a longtime veteran of winemaking, beer brewing, or mead making, stick around. It will be highly informative, and it'll be interesting, and there'll be plenty of information in here that I'm sure that you haven't seen yet. So, thank you, and welcome to Ragnarok. It's some good water. Good water. This isn't Fiji. God, I'm tired of interns. We're going to be taking a look at our tools that we're going to be using, and today we're going to be talking about a hydrometer and a refractometer, what they do and why we're using them. If you're new to the process and you're not too sure what you're doing or why you're doing it, this is a great starting point. So let's go ahead and get started, and if you're already up to date with your tools, go ahead and skip and fly over to this time code here. So here we go. Hydrometer. What does a hydrometer do? Hydrometers work based on the principle of buoyancy. When a hydrometer is placed in a liquid, it displaces a certain volume of liquid and experiences an upward force equal to the weight of the displaced liquid. So we're just doing a buoyancy test on water versus alcohol. Alcohol being a lighter liquid, so your hydrometer is going to sink to the bottom of your graduated cylinder, your beaker, whatever you have it in, and then water is going to have a better buoyancy to it, and that's going to be set at 1.000 specific gravity or 0 Brix. Always. Water should always be at those two. If it's not, then it's, I don't know what you got in your water. It's weird. Get water. And then next we have our refractometers. What is a refractometer and what is it used for? Well, sometimes it's used in food production, agriculture, even the automotive industry has used them, but specifically we're using it to measure the difference between sugar and water. And there's multiple kinds you can get out there. You can even get some for honey. I have one for honey. You could get one for spirits, for distilled spirits. So there's a multitude of refractometers to buy. Make sure you buy the right one when you're buying them. Research it. What does a refractometer measure? Refractometers measure the extent to which a beam of light bends when it passes through a substance, such as liquid. This can be used to identify the liquid and assess its purity and the concentration of any substances which have been added. Again, sugar versus the water. If you're trying to measure your mead or your wines and there's harder material in there like skin, like grape skins or fruit skins or solid fruits, you have to make sure that you're getting cleaner samples so that it's not going to obstruct the view of your findings. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to our data. So let's go ahead and start with this page. This is just my basic data collecting sheet that I use to put my recipe and my filtration process and oak aging if I have it. So malt, if it's a braggot, honey, the fruit, herbs and spices, yeast, the date done, what it is, primary transfer, my first rack, filtration with different sets of microns here, the cycles that I did, how many times did I cycle through it with those filtration pads, and how many pads I used. I guess that's more of an inventory process, but anyway, that's what that is. This over here is where the gold is. So this is just where I put the name of whatever it is that we're working on. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Valkyr. If you're not familiar with it, go to my shop page and check it out. Very delicious. It's an award-winning mead here in Paso. Love it. It's absolutely amazing. And I'll get into the actual recipe of it in a minute. But for now, this is how I collect my data. So, Brix, specific gravity, the temperature, bubbles per minute, which is the CO2 release in the carboy. I just measure it throughout a cycle, like a minute, for instance, bubble per minute. The date, and then these are all dates as well. These are just 2 days in between, so every 3 days I measure all of this, but every single day I'm measuring the CO2 release. So over here I have refractometer and hydrometer readings. The reason I do both bricks and specific gravity, bricks are just easier to chart, and then specific gravity is better for the calculation, but I use both so that if I'm not getting a clear reading, I can always refer to a gravity conversion table. Super beneficial. I love this thing. So even if I feel very comfortable and confident in maybe my specific gravity, I'll correlate it to my bricks and it'll help me balance out a better mathematical conversion for that. So I highly recommend using these often. So that's the data collecting sheet. I hope that wasn't too fast. You can always rewind if you want, obviously. So let's go ahead and get going to the graph. Alright, so what I have here are 2 different charts for 2 different things. This one is for the CO2 release, the bubbles per minute, and this one over here is for our hydrometer and our refractometer readings. As you can see here, day 4, we are up to 35 bubbles per minute. That's the CO2 release coming out of the airlock, compared to our first day, our yeast pitch, which is 2 bubbles per minute. And there are little correlations and little relationships here that match over here, but we're not going to get into that right now because we're just going to try to focus on the ABV. But if you're interested in something like this, a little bit more in depth, please feel free to comment. As I said, over here, we're starting out with our original gravity on a refractometer and hydrometer, almost equal, 5.5 for hydro and 6 for refract. And as it spikes, you can see that it also spikes with it, but then it starts to separate and move apart. The reason for this is, as we discussed, a refractometer and hydrometer are measuring 2 different things. So when it starts out, it's reading essentially the same thing because none of the ingredients have had time to dissolve yet. And that's our main problem with doing original and final gravity on a hydrometer only, because if you did that, you would be missing not only this entire spectrum up here, but you're also missing everything in between 5.5, our original, and 6, our final, which we'll talk more about the calculation aspect of that later. But as for right now, this is what you're missing. You're missing all of this and all of this. And that's why sometimes ABVs like mine, when I first started, were in the negatives or they're extremely low and made absolutely no sense at all. That's why you're missing all of that information. So I have not only this mead in particular for reference, but I also have a second mead that we'll talk about with a very different formula. It's much more complex, and you'll be able to see a bit more activity with that one. This one here used wheat, pilsner, strawberries, raspberries, cranberries, buckwheat honey, and a cider wine yeast. So fairly simple, very nice and clean. Came out at about 9%. Yeah, overall, all this dipping and diving right here is due to the fact that our fruit wasn't reduced down to kind of like a caramelization or reduction. We don't have dissolved sugars when we pitch our yeast. We don't have boiled honey. Everything is still very much in a solid state. And that's why there's all this activity that goes on in between your original and your final gravity. And that's why it's very important to take multiple readings. I was doing it at 7 days apart, but I realized I still wasn't getting a good enough of a number. Every 3 days seems to be a really good perspective. We'll go ahead and we'll flip this over and I'll show you what happens with an even more complex formula. Okay, so this one is my oat mead. This is my favorite one. It is absolutely delicious. I have 2 that I do, but this one is absolutely killer. And as you can see, there is a lot more activity, and not only that, it fermented for almost 2 months, approximately 2 months of fermentation, and then another 2 months of racking. And it was it was so worth the wait. It was really good. And this was only a 5-gallon batch. It was a really long fermentation process. It used 2 different types of oats, 3 different types of malts, 2 types of honey, 3 different fruits, 3 different nuts, 5 different spices and sugars, and then 2 different yeast strands that I like to blend my own yeast to kind of give it multiple aspects to it. 18th day, we have another drop here in our CO2, and then it's kind of steadies out for a really long period of time, just really kind of shambling along. But that's also a nice slow growth and increase here in our hydrometer, and our refractometer just constantly goes. Nothing noticeable here on the CO2, but on day 48, that's when it starts to actually finally drop on both the refractometer and the hydrometer. So, like I said again, it correlates with one another, and it does have some sort of a relationship to it because of the CO2 and the yeast eating and producing the CO2, and clearly as it's eating the sugar sources, it's going to produce more alcohol, and this is what's happening here as well. But you also have all those other sugar sources that aren't unlocked yet, like the fruits, solid sugar if you're adding solid sugar, the honey itself, and anything else you might be using. It's still locked away in there. And I noticed personally that if you're keeping track of this stuff on a daily basis, that the yeast is eating specific sugar sources for a certain period of time and then moving on to other ones. For instance, the new pagan recipe that I have with mugwort, yarrow, and elderflower, I was smelling a lot of those tea aromas first, the honey second, and then the fruit third as it's closing out its fermentation cycle. So as you're going through this process, I think it's really important to keep a daily check on absolutely everything to really get intimate and knowledgeable about what you're doing, and not just putting it in a jug and tossing it away and just leaving it in a closet somewhere, because there's so much going on with it in the meantime that you're not even aware of. And that's why our calculations, that if we're going to use our original and our final, they're not accurate, because you have all this activity going on in between. And if you think it doesn't matter, just wait and see for these calculations. Okay, calculation time. So the way this calculation works out is that I take every peak and every trough. So at the top of every hydrometer and refractometer reading, and at the bottom of every hydrometer and refractometer reading, as if it's an original and a final gravity throughout the entire process. And I add that up as an entire calculation. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and do a mock, well, it's not a mock, it's the real calculations I have for the Valk here. So our refractometer, we have in bricks 6 plus the 7.5 minus 7.25 plus 15.5 minus 15. And if we're using our conversion table that I showed you, that piece of paper that I had, that I got offline, amazing. It helps you dial in things a lot better, and this is what I get for specific gravity. So not only did I take my measurements on paper, but I also used that chart to kind of help dial it in and be a little bit more accurate. So if we convert that over to specific gravity, we have 1.024 plus 1.029 minus 1.028 plus 1.061 minus 1.059, and that equals 1.027. Hydrometer in bricks is 5.5 plus 7 minus 3 plus 7.75 minus 6. Convert that into specific gravity, and we have 1.021 plus 1.027 minus 1.011 plus 1.029 minus 1.023, which equals 1.044. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add up those two different measurements. And the reason for this is not only are we measuring the buoyancy between the liquid, but the interaction between the sugars being lost and gained throughout the entire process. Because if you only did one of those, it would not come out, I think, nearly as accurate, and it does not come out right. That's my perspective, and that's what I've seen throughout my calculation and my breakdown of everything. So if we add those two, actually, sorry, we needed to subtract first. So we take our 1.027 from our refractometer and subtract 1.000. And the reason we're subtracting 1.000 is because 1 equals water. So we're going to literally take the water out of the equation and only be left with the alcohol and the dissolved sugar sources. And then multiply that with 131.25, which is a standard ABV calculation number. It's used pretty readily. Sometimes people just do 131. That gives us an answer of 3.54375. And as I said before, would not be accurate with just a single number. And you'll see that here at the hydrometer as well. So we take our 1.044 minus 1.000, subtract our water there for our 1, multiply with 131.25, and that gives us 5.77500. Again, also too low of a number to be accurate. So then we add those two together and we get 9.31875% ABV. So as you can see throughout that entire process, we're trying to track the rise and decline of our sugar and our alcohol, and we're putting them together, and then we're going to remove the water from it so that that's all that we're left with. For instance, if we were to only do the original and final gravity with a hydrometer only, we would end up with 1.022 minus 1.023 times 131.25, which would equal 0.13125% ABV. I really don't think a month's worth of fermentation would produce less than 0.2% of ABV calculation, and that's why we do it. So if I missed anything, if you feel like something's wrong here, if you feel like my calculation and the way I did this just seems stupid or weird, or you have something to add to it, feel free to comment. That's fine. I'd like to hear other people's ideas on the subject, because I spent years trying to figure this out, and as I said, I would go to forums, I'd go to websites, and they were of zero help. So I started reverse engineering ABV. I started doing tests with alcohol and water mixtures, sugar and water mixtures. The buoyancy of sugar plays a part in things sometimes, and that's why I add that in there as well with the refractometer. And I mean, there's just there's a plethora of information to this that most people do not consider, and they just say, well, with beer that's how it works, and with wine that's how it works, and if you make your mead a certain way, that's how it's going to work with original and final and 131, and then you get your thing. You don't need to do all this adding, subtracting, multiplying and subtracting at the very end, and that's fine. You can do it that way if you want, but I got tired of getting negative numbers, inaccurate numbers, and honestly, I think a 9.3 for what I made was extremely accurate. Other people tasted it and said that it tasted like a 9%. And I was like, okay, well that checks out. My math is pretty on the money with that one. Not that that's like a for sure thing, obviously, but I think it helps add a little bit of security to the fact that I feel like my calculations were a little bit more correct. If you're interested in seeing a review on the Valkyr and the oat mead, I have a video for that. Go check it out on my YouTube page. It's under Valkyr and oat mead taste test, I believe. Well, anyway, that's what I got going. I appreciate everybody listening. If it interested you and you want to hear more information, feel free to comment. Hit the like button, of course, and share. Let's see if other people agree with this or not. Take it easy. Delicious Fiji water. Someone did their job.